Hi guys, welcome to my channel Lush Gardener. I hope you guys are fine and are safe. In today's video, we will be talking about 6 things that can go wrong with succulents if you tend to not follow these things, especially for beginners. Now, the first and the most important thing is light. Now guys, you have to ensure that you are giving a good amount of light, either indirect bright light or morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours, depending upon the variety of succulent. Because every succulent out there in nature, in their natural habitat, tends to get a good amount of light, either in form of indirect bright light or in form of direct morning sunlight. So you have to ensure that you give them a good amount of light. So here I have 2 examples of my Graptosedum ghostii. Both are Graptosedum ghostii. This one has been getting a good amount of indirect bright light throughout the day, and you can see it's very compact. Now it was not getting any morning direct sunlight. That is the reason why the colors are not very intense. It was just getting indirect bright light, and you can see the plant is pretty much doing quite well. Very compact. Of late it is changing its color. It's fading off the color because there is not much sunlight due to the current monsoon season, but still the plant is very compact. On the other hand, this is another Graptosedum ghostii. Now recently I started introducing it to morning direct sunlight, and now it is out in full morning direct sunlight after acclimating it. Now it tends to get morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours. So you can see the leaves are much more pink in color, but initially the plant was stretching. As you can see, it lacked a lot of light. That is why you can see there is a lot of gap in between the leaves and the stem is visible. Ideally the stem should not be visible this much. As you can see over here, it should be very compact, but you can see it had started to stretch. As soon as I started giving it light, you can see now the new growth. There are 2 sets of these leaves which do not have any space between them. So you have to ensure that you give them a good amount of light. Either you can give them indirect bright light for at least 8 to 9 hours, or you can give them morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours after acclimating it. But if you're going to keep it in indirect bright light, there is no need to acclimate it because you do not get direct sunlight. It's absolutely safe to keep your succulents in indirect bright light without acclimating it. So this was the first point that we wanted to talk about. The second point is related with the drain hole. So every pot, if you are a beginner, a lot of people who have experience with succulents will tend to use pots that do not have a drain hole, but then there is a technique how to water. You have to be extremely careful. There are a lot of things that get into it. So if you are a beginner, please avoid using a pot that does not have a drain hole. It can be little difficult for beginners. A lot of experienced people tend to keep succulents in pots that do not have drain hole, but then you have to be extremely careful while watering. So if you are a beginner, you have not yet figured out how to water succulents, then using a pot that does not have a drain hole can add a lot of trouble to you and can possibly go wrong, wherein you might end up overwatering your succulent because the water does not drain out of the pot. So it is going to be very tricky for you to handle such succulents. So to be on the safer side, to go the easy way, always use a pot that has a drain hole and the pot is not too deep. Around 8 to 10 centimeters pot is going to work out really well with a drain hole. If you can go with any earthen pots, concrete pots or unglazed clay pots would work out really well, because these material pots tend to pull out the excess moisture from the soil. The next thing that you want to keep in mind is the soil mix. Now this is where I have seen a lot of beginners tend to make mistakes. Now your soil has to be loose, porous and well draining. Depending upon the type of succulent, some succulents like a little bit more of moisture in the soil, like Haworthias. They prefer a little bit of moisture. If they prefer a little bit of moisture, you can make the same mix what I tend to make: 80% of aquarium sand and 20% of filtered garden soil. Now this is a kind of standard mix for all of my succulents, but there are certain succulents that require a little bit more watering. So what I tend to do is I just increase the ratio or decrease the ratio of the sand. For example, if I have a succulent that requires a little bit more watering, then what I'm going to do is I will reduce the aquarium sand and I will increase the garden soil quantity. Let's say I'm going to make it 70-30 or 60-40, depending upon how the succulent is, how much of watering does the succulent require, because there are certain varieties of succulents that do require a little bit more watering compared to others. But the most important thing that you need to understand is the soil has to be loose, the soil has to be porous, and the soil has to be well draining. At no given point of time, the soil should get compact or the soil should not be well draining. At times you might have noticed the moment you water, the water does not flow out of the pot. It starts to get stagnant in the pot. That is not going to work out really well. Apart from that, I have also seen a lot of people tend to use peat moss or cocoa peat or cocoa coir. You need to understand these materials tend to retain a lot of moisture. If you're going to plant your succulents in this, it's not that the succulent is going to die the next day. It's not that the succulent is going to die within a week, within a month. It can take a couple of months, probably 3 to 6 months, and then the succulent will show signs of having issues. So it's always better in the first go itself, go for the right kind of soil mix, go for a very sandy kind of a mix, something that has a good amount of perlite, pumice. That's optional. But if you want to go with the basic soil, you can go with aquarium sand, any sand that has a slightly bigger granules with a little bit of filtered garden soil. And ensure it's always better to test your soil before you plant your succulents. Probably you can make a batch and put it into the pot, add water and see that the water is draining out, how soon or how fast the soil tends to dry. If you feel that you need to amend a little bit, you can then make the changes and then you can start putting that soil in the pot. So it's always better to do a small test kit of your soil before adding your succulents in it. The next point what I have seen is a wrong pairing of succulents. Now this is again very common because when you are a beginner, you want to make an arrangement that is very colorful and you want to add all those colors that are available in the succulents. But you need to understand that there are certain varieties of succulents that are going to stay green, which do not prefer direct sunlight. Whereas there are succulents that have really bright colors which enjoy a good amount of morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours. They will also tend to do well in indirect bright light, but if you tend to give them a good amount of morning direct sunlight, they have this really beautiful intense color. They have this blush of color on them. So a lot of times we want to put them out in morning direct sunlight. The main reason why we want to keep succulents is because they are very colorful. So if you're going to give them a good amount of morning direct sunlight, then the colors will get even more intense. Whereas the succulents that are green in color like Haworthias, like the Crassula, a lot of these succulents do not change the color if you put them out in morning direct sunlight. They will stay green, but unfortunately these succulents cannot take morning direct sunlight and they will start slowly turning brown in color or will start getting burnt, because these succulents, they lack the anthocyanin, the pigment that tends to protect succulents from direct sunlight or from the UV rays. These succulents cannot change the color, due to which it can go terribly wrong and your green colored succulents will start getting burnt, while your colored succulents will start to have that intense color. So you have to ensure that you have the correct pairings of your succulents. Again, your succulents can be paired again depending upon the dormancy and non-dormancy. For me, it's not a big issue because I do not use fertilizers. But if you are a person who tends to use fertilizers, you will have to further divide it based on the dormancy and non-dormancy. Because if you're adding fertilizers and if you have a dormant succulent with a non-dormant succulent, then of course the dormant succulent will start having issues. So again, you should never pair your succulents incorrectly. First and the most important thing is pair them according to the amount of light that they require, whether they require direct sunlight, whether they require indirect bright light. And then you can further go ahead and divide them based on dormancy and non-dormancy only if you tend to fertilize or add nutrients to your succulents. The next point would be watering. Now, as I've said this earlier as well, most of the succulents belong to arid conditions. They do not have a lot of water in their natural habitat. But again, it depends from succulents to succulents. What I have noticed is, especially the succulents that are in the green color, or the ones that have more of the color green and do not change the color, the ones that prefer indirect bright light are the ones that prefer a very slight amount of moisture, or I would say a little bit more frequent watering as compared to the other varieties of succulents that are brightly colored. Because most of these brightly colored succulents are out in morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours, and a lot of times the soil tends to dry much faster. And even then, after the soil has been bone dry, you can again wait for a couple of days, or probably a day or so, or 2 or 3 days, depending how your environment is and how the succulent is showing up the results. If it is showing any wrinkles, you can go ahead and water it. But if the succulent looks very healthy, it looks very well hydrated, you can again wait for another couple of days. But always remember, a lot of succulents like Echuarias, Sedums, Graptoverias, Graptopetalums, all of these succulents prefer their soil to be bone dry before you go ahead and water it again. As you can see over here, this is my Echuaria Lola. The soil is completely bone dry, which means that I can go ahead and water it. So always ensure that you water your succulents only when the soil is bone dry, especially for the succulents that are brightly colored. The succulents that are in morning direct sunlight for 5 to 6 hours, if you wait for the soil to be completely bone dry, only then go ahead and water it. Now the next point is what can go wrong is your watering technique. Now this is where a lot of people mess up, I would say, especially the beginners. You have to understand that you only need to water the soil. Please do not water on the succulent. All you have to do is just take any bottle that has a nozzle and start watering it around the succulent. You can water however you want, in a circular motion or in just one place, but always remember the water has to be only directly into the soil and not on the succulent, because if you're going to water on the succulent, then there is a high chance that water is going to stay on the succulent leaves, especially if your succulents are out in morning direct sunlight. If those water droplets tend to stay on the succulent, that will scar the leaves, that will burn the leaves. In fact, it can even lead to a fungal or a rot, especially crown rot is very common if the water tends to stay on the leaves. So ensure that you do not water on the succulent. There are a couple of videos out there wherein they just take a hose and they start watering all their succulents from above. You need to understand they might be probably from a very different environment, which is very dry, which is very cool. But for a lot of people who are from tropical environment, including myself, I belong to a tropical environment. I have experienced this initially when I started growing succulents. I used to follow the same method. I used to water the succulents from above, or I used to just take a mug of water and just pour it on the succulent, and I noticed that my succulents were having the worst time of their life. So please be very careful. Whether you are from a dry place, whether you are from a humid environment, whether you're from a tropical, non-tropical, whatever environment, I would just say, to be on the safer side, just water the succulent soil and do not drop any water on the succulent leaves. Because whether you are from an environment that is dry and cool, or whether you are from an environment that is warm and humid, but the sun rays are going to remain the same. If the water stays on the succulent leaves, it will magnify through those water droplets and will burn the succulent leaves. So it's always better to water the succulent soil as much as possible and do not drop your water on the leaves. If you happen to drop water on the leaves, you always have a succulent blower, you can blow it off. I have seen people, they just show half of the portion of the watering. They take a hose and they water it from above, but they don't show a later part. A lot of people tend to blow off that water after the video, and just to give that beautiful look of watering succulents from above, they show that part, but they don't show the part wherein they blow off that water, because I have seen people doing that. At times they show that they are blowing off the water, at times they don't show it. So do not fall into the wrong practices. You have the soil, you have enough amount of soil, you can just focus on the soil and not on the succulent. So guys, these were all the tips that can go wrong with succulents if you do not follow the right technique. I hope that this video was helpful to you. If it was, please hit the like button, and if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing to it. Until then, take care, stay safe and keep planting.